Why hello you lovely little peppercorns, my name's Noa Lee, god of game criticism and lord of excellent taste, and Animal Well is a puzzle platforming metroidvania from indie game developer Billy Basso and is, by far, one of the most enjoyably cryptic games I've ever played. It's the kind of game that, upon a first glance, doesn't look like all that much, but as you dive deeper into the well, you'll soon realize that the bottom may be a lot farther down than you initially thought. On a surface level, Animal Well is probably most reminiscent of other puzzle platformers along the lines of La Mulana and Fez, as well as top-down adventure puzzlers like Tunic, the latter two of which are even paid homage to in the form of a couple of easy-to-activate Easter eggs. And while Animal Well isn't shy about wearing its inspirations on its sleeve, its developer also wasn't beholden to working within a set genre or framework, following the path of heartful design and his personal artistic muse wherever they may lead. Billy Basso got his start in the game industry quite some time ago, working with studios like NetherRealm, Phosphor Games, and Level X, and since 2017 has been working on his own project and coding his own custom game engine and renderer to bring it all to life. That project is of course today's subject, Animal Well, Billy's first independent release and one that took nearly 7 years of love and dedication to craft. You play as, Kirby, I guess, who has just sprouted from a flower bud, and your goal is to, do something. I don't know. Okay, so clearly this is the kind of game where what you need to do and where you need to go is entirely player-driven. One little ominous cutscene showing 4 flames, one squirrel running away from you after leaving your flower bud, that's all you get, and that's all you need, as the rest of the experience is entirely open to be explored however you wish. At its core, Animal Well is a metroidvania, but it's sort of a metroidvania with a twist, as unlike most games in the genre, this isn't an action game, but instead a puzzle game. Rather than your typical metroidvania upgrade sequence being tied to different weapons and abilities, all of Animal Well's items are designed around their utility as puzzle solving and movement devices, with items like the yo-yo allowing you to hit switches that are just out of reach, the slinky, which when combined with stair-like segments of the environment can be used as a sort of timer that can activate switches on its own while you make your way to the opposite end of the room, as well as reaching areas that you can't, the bubble wand, which allows you to create a floating bubble platform, and the frisbee, which can be used to distract dogs and hit switches in alcoves that are too far away or too narrow to reach with your yo-yo. In addition, practically all of these items have secret uses to them that aren't immediately obvious and that the game never even hints at, with the player just having to experiment and mess about with their items in a wide variety of contexts in order to discover them. For example, the yo-yo can be used to draw the attention of certain animals and even coax them into moving in the direction the yo-yo is pointing, but it can also be used to break spiky stalagmites and tights, while the frisbee can be jumped upon and allow you to ride it across large gaps, or even be used as a platform in certain areas that are too tight to utilize the bubble wand in. Some later items, like the bouncy ball, might even take up space in your inventory for quite some time before you even figure out what the hell they're for and under what circumstances they can be utilized in, while you will almost certainly find many instances where you clearly require an item you don't yet possess and are left to wonder just where and what this item may be, or you find yourself questioning if these moments are just another indication of some unknown ability of an item you already possess. This is by far one of my favorite aspects of the game, as each and every item you obtain seems almost pointless or even silly until you figure out how to use them, while experimenting with these items under different circumstances and discovering for yourself different abilities that you've had all along but only now realize how to use is a lot of fun and a great way to reward the player for experimentation and thinking outside the box, and all without a single weapon or combat ability, making this game quite the breath of fresh air in a genre that's been so oversaturated for so long. There are hazards, there are dangerous creatures to overcome, sure, but there's no combat per se, only different ways to agitate or trick the creatures of this world into leaving you alone or doing your bidding. This non-combat stance seems to have been a primary goal from the get-go, as even early screenshots and videos of the game highlight this downplaying of action to allow the player to focus on the puzzles, platforming segments, and cryptic ciphers. However, that doesn't mean that there aren't some intense moments in the game either, because there certainly are. Each interaction with the ostrich and kangaroo in particular are nail-biting experiences, while some of the sections you're required to traverse leave little room for error should your platforming skills and timing not be up to snuff. This, to me, is one of the most impressive aspects of Animal Well, as despite its overall laid-back design, it manages to deliver an experience with rising and falling tension, peaks and valleys in both the pace of the game as well as in its overall tone. Most of this changing of tension comes about naturally through the stellar level design, which sees each and every area you go to having a seamless change in tempo from room to room, as different sections, themes, and even puzzles and platforming segments flow naturally into the next, with the tension either ramping up up the deeper into a section you go, or ramping down as you approach the center of the map. Overall, the game is divided into 4 main areas, or temples as I'm going to call them, with each taking up the majority of space within the map's 4 corner quadrants, with the initial goal of the game being to go to each of these temples and retrieve one of 4 flames that are needed to unlock a new path in the center of the map in a manner straight out of Super Metroid. Each of these temples features similar theming and animal occupants, though the game never goes as far as to populate these areas exclusively with one species or family of creatures, as the game isn't afraid to include a unique and potentially out of place animal interaction or puzzle if it serves the overall section's goal, yet the animalistic spirit of whichever area you're in is always maintained. For example, one of the temple flames is indicated by an iguana statue in the central room, so you'd expect that flame's temple to be populated by lizards and other reptiles, but when you actually go there, you find that most of its residents are actually hedgehogs and chinchillas, capybaras, and crows, with only minimal lizard imagery, while the path to the flame itself is actually guarded by a giant chameleon rather than an iguana. However, the color palette, asset design, and even the very structure of rooms and how they fit together still allude to this lizardy essence. To this end, Animal Well's animal motif is expressed not through the physicality of the animals it chooses to include, as you might see in a children's storybook or on their bedroom wallpaper, but rather it exudes the spirit of these creatures and how they make one feel on a primal level. This area feels lizardy, this area feels mousy, this area doggy or fishy or penguiny, regardless of whether or not those creatures are present in the area. Much of this is aided by the downright moody atmosphere the game so expertly crafts through the use of its visuals, lighting effects, and sound design. Graphically, this game is just gorgeous, ending up as one of the most detailed and carefully constructed pixel games I've ever played. None of the designs or sprites in this game are particularly detailed when taken on their own, or indeed all that impressive, yet in-game as a singular piece of a larger tapestry of copious level assets, character sprites, animation frames, and particle effects, the game delivers a striking visual tableau that rarely becomes overcrowded and never visually muddy, as each piece is placed with such subtle care and nuance that there's always enough contrast and elements to easily distinguish one individual piece from all its neighbors. Though perhaps it's a choice to design all these assets with the intention of using scan lines that really sets Animal Well's aesthetic apart from the larger pixel art crowd. For you see, the oft-forgotten truth of pixel art of the past, i.e. the games that my old ass grew up with, was that they were never intended to look like this, with sharp individually identifiable pixels, but rather were designed to work with the scanning electron gun of CRT displays to create an image that looked more like this, blending pixels together in such a way that each sprite looks like a solid image rather than a blocky raster. Yet with the death of the CRT and the rise of modern progressive displays, this style was sort of left behind and forgotten about by the time the retro revival of the late 2000s and early 2010s came along, the games of which brought us not a return to the look and feel of games of the past, but a new graphical movement brought on by a change in technology and a lack of the tools and displays necessary to recreate that old look. Some games and emulators of course recognized this fact and tried to mimic the look of a CRT through the use of scan lines, but because developers of this time were typically designing these pixelated graphics on modern displays and then layering scan lines on top of them after the fact, this combination never really looked right, as the pixel art itself had clearly been designed to look good on a modern display, not on an old one, combined with the fact that imitation scan lines have never quite been able to replicate the look of a CRT, even when emulating retro games. Thus, we as gamers just sort of became used to the idea that pixel art looks like this, with many, myself included, even preferring the sharp pixelated look of emulated retro games over their OG hardware CRT rendered counterparts, despite the fact that this isn't what these games looked like back when we were kids. Billy Basso, however, has taken a different approach entirely toward this aesthetic question. Rather than trying to use scan lines in an attempt to mimic the look and feel of a CRT and hopefully trick the brain into ignoring them and seeing the art as one solid, unpixelated image, he instead decided to embrace this imitation scanline look, seeing it not as a necessary evil toward delivering a softer pixel art style, but rather as an aesthetic choice that should be celebrated. To be clear, this game doesn't look like a forgotten retro game displayed on a CRT, but rather something new and innovative that embraces the inherent limitations of modern displays and digital painting software. And while Animal Well looks damn fine with the scan lines turned off, it's clear that this wasn't the intended look of the game, as with the scan lines, the game manages to deliver a striking aesthetic that really makes all the game's intricate sprite work fit together in glorious fashion. This has certainly been attempted before, but never has it been so successful. However, the game goes far beyond providing merely a beautiful pixel art neo-retro aesthetic by also delivering one of the most lively games ever created in this style. True to its theme, Animal Well has populated its world with tons of animals all doing their own thing and all with their own natural behaviors and mannerisms. Some of these, like the previously mentioned chinchillas, react by walking toward you when you're on the same plane as them, while others, like hummingbirds, will fly down and pop bubbles that you're standing upon and attempting to use as a platform, while other animals will simply remain in the background doing their own thing, completely oblivious to your presence. Yet, it's not just the animals that cause this world to feel alive in a way that few other games before have managed, but the very environment itself. Vines will drape over you and other creatures as you move by, grass will react to your presence, waterfalls cascade over many rooms, tiny pixelated fireflies float by while water drips from certain ceilings, and mechanisms whir and grind around you, all of which is perfectly accompanied by some truly exceptional sound effects and audio design. And while there's actually very little music present in this game, its absence isn't really even noticed, as there's such a wide variety and number of sound effects being played at any given moment that music would have only distracted from the rich rhythmic medley the game so otherwise provides, as most of the game delivers an atmosphere akin to a forest at night, with all the individual sounds of creatures and the environment itself delivering their own musical solos that combine into a symphony of sound and character. This is a creative choice that I'm seeing more and more in the indie space as time goes on. It's a willingness to use music only when absolutely necessary so as not to distract from everything else that the game is building toward. The recent Children of the Sun that I talked about a few weeks ago made a similar choice to forego a soundtrack in favor of composing a mosaic of sound, and here's Animal Well following suit, though the latter also isn't shy about occasionally using a more traditional soundtrack to underline certain moments when this sort of thing is warranted, and it does so to great effect. It's nice to see that more and more developers are starting to pick up on the fact that in a lot of games, music is always seen as an afterthought that's placed on top of pre-existing work rather than being developed alongside the rest of the experience, and in many cases is used as a crutch to distract the player from the fact that the rest of the game isn't really all that interesting. I can't tell you how many times I've seen people praise a game for being a thrill ride or for being sad or whatever, only for the game they're talking about to actually be a mediocre pile that just so happens to have an excellent soundtrack which emotionally manipulates them into thinking that it's the video game that's pumping them up or making them cry, when really it's just the music. I mean, hell, Sonic Team's practically made a career out of doing this very thing, so clearly a lot of people are vulnerable to this deceptive trick. Thankfully, this practice is becoming less and less common in the indie scene, and even a bit in the AAA industry, as developers dive deeper into the medium of video games and further understand that music is merely one tool in the toolbox, and one that can be used either as a chainsaw or a scalpel, depending on how and where you choose to utilize it. Taking it all into consideration, the graphics and aesthetics, the sound design and atmosphere, the lively environment and excellent level design, and of course the unique items and stellar puzzles they coincide with, and Animal Well ends up as one of the most fully realized and punchy games to grace our screens in quite some time, as well as one that is polished to a mirror sheen and technically optimized to a level rarely seen. You can really tell that Animal Well is running on a custom engine specifically designed for it, everything from the lack of lag to the solid frame rate, as well as how punchy it all feels when in motion alludes to this very fact. One of the things that's been on my mind a lot recently is the subject of game engines and how they've been both a boon and a detriment to video games as an artistic medium over the past 10 years or so. On the one hand, engines like Unity and Unreal, or even Game Maker and RPG Maker, have greatly lowered the barrier of entry to making games, opening the door to a wellspring of untapped creativity. And while this has also opened the door to a bevy of grifters and artistic hacks, I sort of see this as a lesser problem to a much more insidious one. And that's the issue, that as developers get more and more skilled with the engines they're using, and the number of engines being used gets smaller and smaller, as is becoming increasingly more true with each passing year, the games that are made using these engines, even if they're wildly different conceptually from one another, all start looking and feeling the same. In my last video, for example, I critiqued Another Crab's Treasure, and while overall I found it to be excellent, I also can't deny that it practically oozes with that classic Unity engine game feel, for better or for worse. The way the lighting is rendered, the way the physics feel, the places where the game hiccups and stutters, these are all hallmarks of the Unity engine and are aspects that color the greater experience, and this is true of all engines, not just Unity. The problem isn't the use of Unity or even Unreal, as some have claimed, just that the average gamer has, at this point, played so many games made in these engines that they're starting to catch on to each engine's idiosyncrasies and attributing them to a failure on the part of the developer, rather than realizing realizing that this feel is often just the result of using the same tools as everyone else. And this, to me, is another area where Animal Well truly stands apart from the rest of the crowd. By choosing to make his own engine specifically to bring this game to life, Billy Basso absolutely added a ton of extra work to his project, but in doing so, he also ensured that his game would look, feel, and play like nothing else on the market, an aspect that further increases Animal Well's air of mystique and mystery, its tone and atmosphere. I'm not saying that every developer needs to go back to the old ways of coding their own games from scratch or developing an in-house engine, as that's pretty unrealistic for most developers, but maybe we should start thinking of engines less like editing software and more like musical instruments, choosing engines for a game based not on what we already know and are comfortable with, but rather as a tool that may fit some projects better than others. After all, there's a reason why so many horror games and eerie walking simulators were made in Valve's Source engine that went beyond the tool simply being free and easy to use. The engine just so happens to have an aesthetic and physics that perfectly complement the creepy atmosphere of these types of games. Or maybe if we really want to create something new, we should seek out and use lesser known or even outdated game engines. Pepper Grinder's developer ARGs did just that by using Construct 2, whatever the hell that is, and the results were glorious, delivering a game that feels like nothing else around simply through relying on a tool that very few are utilizing. Now, if you're familiar with my work, you know that this is the part of the video where I've pretty much completely gone off the rails about talking about this game as a game, and I'm about to dive really deep with what the overall project is about and how well it succeeds or fails when taken as a whole work of art rather than as a piece of entertainment with individual strengths and weaknesses. And I wonder why I have such terrible audience retention on all my videos. Something I haven't mentioned yet is the concept of layers, which is how Billy Basso himself viewed the game during development, with Layer 1 of Animal Well being to simply beat the game, Layer 2 being the game's equivalent of 100% completion, Layer 3 being a series of extremely well-hidden puzzles and secrets that most players will probably never even realize are there, and Layer 4 being a cryptic cipher that would make even the Zodiac Killer go, dude, what the fuck? And you might think from hearing that the game is literally constructed in layers, but in actuality it's not, with all of the layers intermingled amongst one another, often having puzzles and rooms from one layer overlapping with objects and secrets from another, to the point that the game occasionally gets super meta by having puzzles within other puzzles and secret rooms that lead to secret rooms that might actually lead to a third or fourth secret room. Overall, I think this is a brilliant way to think about and sculpt games, as by design it creates a lot of depth to the project and injects a lot of mystery that, combined with the moody atmosphere brought on by the game's excellent graphics and sound design, causes you to feel like you're exploring something long kept hidden, that each and every secret and puzzle is all directing you toward a greater truth that was never meant to be seen by mortal eyes. All this expects the player to think outside the box to varying degrees and utilize each and every item in unique and clever ways, leverage the level design to force the game's mechanics to their very breaking points, often in ways that feel like you're cheating or executing a solution never intended by the developer, only to later find out that that was the solution all along, while occasionally also discovering ways to exploit the game that probably weren't expected but are allowed by the overall design, like how I went through this spike room here using the frisbee because I didn't yet have the hamster wheel. And let's just say that this kind of experience is right up my alley, and I relished each and every moment of it during my playthrough. My playthrough, which lasted just over 30 hours, I might add, even though you can actually beat this game in under 30 minutes if you know what you're doing. Each time I would play, I would get further drawn in and make a little more progress, find something hidden that I had walked past 100 times but had overlooked, and found myself right at the end of Layer 2 without looking up anything, finding it all on my own without anyone else's help. To say that I became a bit obsessed with this game would be an understatement, as I was determined to find everything myself, to avoid spoilers like the plague, to keep digging deeper and finding new ways to exploit the game's mechanics and uncover the mysteries that so enticed me. At this point, I would have rather abandoned the game entirely and never reach the bottom of the well than give in and look something up. That is, until one night when I spent almost 5 hours wandering through the game and not finding one secret, hidden room, or even generating a single idea of what I should try next or where I should even look, that a disturbing thought began creeping into my mind. What if this game isn't meant to be solved on your own? What if Billy Basso, that beautiful, evil bastard, had designed the game in such a way that it can't be solved on your own? And so, phone trembling in hand as I finally succumbed to the very thing I swore I would never do, I googled that shit, and to my disappointment, I was right. You can't solve everything yourself, and the game was never meant to be played that way. Granted, about 99% of this game could theoretically be figured out by a single person, as there's only one puzzle that I know of that requires outside help. That damn bunny mural, which requires at least 50 people working together to solve, as the game randomly generates one of 50 colored tiles into your game, and you need all 50 to figure out what the image is, and it's clear upon reflection that the game was never intended to be played the way that I was playing it, and that I was merely on a fool's errand. Instead, the game post Layer 2 is meant to be taken as an ARG of sorts, designed with such cryptic solutions and out-of-the-box thinking that it's unlikely that any one person would have enough perspective, ideas, knowledge, or indeed patience to figure everything out all on their own, and that the intent was that the game would start a discussion and a community effort to reach its greater depths. And that's super cool, as that's the kind of thing that you can't really do in any other medium outside of ARGs and conspiracy theories, but I also can't deny that this realization and subsequent confirmation kinda killed my enthusiasm for trying to figure things out for myself, and actually for the game as a whole. Prior to this realization, I was hooked on this game in a way that I've never really experienced before. For a solid 2 weeks, it was always on my mind, and I would toss and turn at night thinking about it and wake up with excitement in the middle of the night as my subconscious generated new ideas and things to try that I could experiment with the following evening when I finally sat down to play it. And because I was making progress with each and every session, even if it was only a minuscule amount, I kept coming back for more. This game sort of consumed me, and I felt like an archaeologist uncovering some ancient ruins or an explorer carving a path through a hidden temple that had been lost for thousands of years. While playing, I had the very real sense that if I kept digging, kept working at it, eventually it would all make sense and I could proudly claim that I had conquered it all on my own without succumbing to the very thing that so many gamers these days give into without a second thought, choosing to look something up when they get stuck simply because they don't have the patience or drive to continue on their own. Games like this don't come around very often, and when they do, they're almost never this well designed or enjoyable to play, and for that reason alone, I felt obligated to give it my due diligence and see how deep I could make it, or even get to the point where I was forced to admit defeat and prostrate myself before the trickster god named Billy and accept that I don't have what it takes to uncover all its mysteries. But after the realization that this is an impossible endeavor, all that came to an end, and I'll be honest, I felt a bit cheated. I had put all that time and effort and mental energy into the game, being led to believe that it was worthy of that level of dedication and investment, only to find out that I had not only been lied to, but tricked, that the game is, in a way, designed to break you, to force you to look up solutions and rely on the community to continue your exploration. That on your own, you can only go so deep down the well before you begin to drown. Now, let me be clear that what I just said isn't a criticism of the game. Quite the contrary, I think it points to just how deep and shrewd and expertly crafted the game really is. This is entirely a me problem, as I just so happen to be the very kind of person that a game like this was designed, intentionally or not, to fuck with. Allow me to psychoanalyze myself a little bit here, since, I do that to game developers all the time. It's only fair that I do that to myself once in a while. I'm a pretty antisocial guy. I don't have a lot of friends, and I spend around 95% of my time alone, and I prefer it that way. I'm happiest when I'm alone, as my solitude gives me time to pursue the things I'm passionate about and learn the things I want to learn, develop skills that allow me a greater level of independence and autonomy, and because of that, I'm not on social media. I'm not on Discord or all that active on Reddit, and I rarely participate in Steam discussion forums. Those things are exhausting to me, and I've never really understood the desire to talk to strangers on the internet, let alone form and maintain a community with them. And if it weren't for the fact that I like making videos and critiquing games, I wouldn't even be here on YouTube, and I certainly wouldn't read or respond to the comments that I get on my work, which is something I find myself doing less and less the older I get. I'm also a very driven person. I don't get invested easily, but when I do, I go at it with full force, and I almost always see things through to the end, regardless of how long it takes or how much time, money, and effort is needed to get there. I'm not one of those people that gets hooked easily but loses interest after only a few days or weeks. I'm almost always in it for the long haul if I get to the point where something really grips me, and because of that, I wanted to see Animal Well through to the end, because it did hook me, it did get me invested in a way that I so rarely am, but it's clear that this just isn't the kind of game that's meant meant to be played the way that I want to play it, and that I was mistaken for thinking it was. Maybe that's the point, some message like we're all in this together, and those that fight alone die alone, so take my hand and let's dive deeper together. And you know, part of me really likes that message, despite me being an antisocial weirdo who would rather fight and die alone, but I also can't deny that it sort of sucks when a game is designed like this, because once the community has figured it all out, there's no more exploration left to be done. For those that come later, after all the mysteries have been solved, all that's left to do is copy a pixelated bunny from your phone screen onto a wall. And part of me just thinks that this isn't a good way to design games at all. It's one thing if everything's really cryptic and difficult to solve without the aid of others, but it's another if you expect your players to seek outside help, because if you weren't part of the community effort that worked together to solve those cryptic puzzles, then you're missing out on a key aspect of what this game is and what the intention was. Animal Well's been out for less than a month at the time of writing this, and it seems like the community has already solved all of its major puzzles and answered all the important questions, so if you're just now getting into the game, it's almost as if you can no longer engage with the latter half of it, since looking up how to proceed doesn't lead you to discussion forums of people working together to try and figure things out, but rather to the very answers that flat out spoil the fun and intrigue. The biggest problem I see with this is that there's no clear delineation between the parts of the game you're meant to do on your own and the parts that are intended to be solved by a group, which incentivizes just looking up everything once you get stuck, as you have no way of knowing if you've simply overlooked something or if you've stumbled upon one of the pinch points that require a community effort. The idea of layered game design, where layer 1 and 2 are a single player experience and layer 3 and 4 are meant as a community ARG, is a neat one, but in practice the game isn't really in layers at all, as everything is blended together and it's difficult to discern which aspects belong to which layer. Billy Basso is obviously a genius, and I don't want to give the impression that his work is somehow less impactful because of this fact of the game. This is a project with a lot of heart that was obviously an exercise in iteration and experimentation and a desire to follow the muse wherever she went, the very things that I look for and expect from an artist working in this medium. But he also strikes me as the kind of artist whose work must span multiple mediums. It's clear that the man has a great interest in ARGs and creating puzzles and interactions that transcend the realm of video games, as he created several of those in the months leading up to the game's release as a way to get people excited for and prepare them for the main event, and I think that's great. I love when an artist has the artistic bravery to go where the muse takes them, even if it's somewhere that I, as a video game critic with no interest in ARGs and community discussions, can't follow. When I zoom out to the level that encapsulates the whole project, the game, the community, the ARGs, and even the articles and videos made about all of it, what I see is a masterpiece. But when I zoom into the level of video games, the medium that I care so deeply for and have dedicated my life to discussing and encouraging this medium's artists to go deeper and reach for higher heights, I kind of see it all as a missed opportunity, that Animal Well would have been a whole lot better as a video game if it had stayed in the realm of video games, rather than being a large piece of a greater alternate reality gaming project. Admittedly, a lot of that comes from my own personal bias against other mediums, as video games are what I care about, and anything that steps outside of that realm always feels a bit gimmicky to me, but I also can't deny that now that all of the layer 3 and 4 puzzles have been solved by the Animal Well community, the game now sort of has all this unnecessary baggage attached to it that kind of distracts from layer 1 and 2, the layers that are clearly meant to be the body of the game, as if all the ARG elements are now a vestigial growth that has long since stopped circulating blood. But you know, that's the double-edged sword of that heartful design that I so strongly advocate for on this channel, that sometimes, or perhaps even more often than not, the muse is going to lead you astray, and that the final project will end up as botched or mangled in some way, or in this case, you end up stepping outside of the realm of the very thing you initially set out to create. But personally, I wouldn't have it any other way. Had Billy Basso tugged down the reins of his project to try and keep it within the realm of video games, he would have been doing the very thing that I think is the opposite of creating great art, the antithesis of heartful design. Instead, he followed his heart and trusted his muse, and even though I'm personally a bit disappointed by what the final project became, I'm so glad he did, because that's the very type of artistry I want to see more of in the world. I just wish that I could have come along for the whole ride. I'm Noa Lee, god of game criticism, and thus have I spoken.